My name is Jim Cornett, and I am what we call a consulting ecologist that has worked for many, many years here in the Coachella Valley. Most of you, I think, know me from my newspaper column in the Desert Sun, and the Rancho Mirage Library invites me to come talk every year, it seems like. I think I've been doing this for, I can't even remember how many years now. Today we're going to talk about something that I get more questions about than any other subject, and that would be natural disasters. Floods, fires, earthquakes, and over the years I've answered a lot of questions, and I thought what I should do is put together a program and try to answer all the questions you might have at one time. And we will have an opportunity after my presentation to talk a little bit more about these and answer some specific questions that you have. The good news is this is not a natural disaster that we need to worry about anymore. It's been about 65 million years since some of those large Tyrannosaurus carnivores were running around on planet Earth. So this is not a natural issue that we need to deal with. So with that, I'm going to start the program, and here we go. And this, we'll be talking about natural disasters. Most of these are things that happen fairly quickly, but I will, at the end of the program, talk a lot about natural disasters that sometimes take many decades, if not centuries, to occur. Now, I need to read this. This program is not intended to alarm or frighten. Rather, it is hoped the contents will lead to actions that reduce or eliminate property damage or injury in the event of a potentially harmful natural event. That's my disclaimer. Whoop, let's see. Got to keep going the same direction here. Okay, I've got it. Now, potentially catastrophic events do not include those of an extraterrestrial origin. I'm not going to talk about asteroid impacts or massive solar flares or invasions by aliens. This is not the kind of natural disaster I'll be talking about today. When we think of big events in the Coachella Valley, the first thing that comes to most of our mind is wind. It's a little breezy today. We've got a high-pressure system over Nevada pushing air into the coast. It's not particularly bad today because the wind is coming from east to west, and it tends to increase in velocity when it goes through the passes. So if you're on the other side of the mountains, that's where the wind is going to be very, very strong. Wind in our area is a seasonal phenomenon, and it's most severe in the upper valley as opposed to the lower valley. This is a photograph of a sandstorm taken in 1978. It looks a lot like the worst sandstorm we ever had, which occurred in 1979. We had winds coming out of the San Gorgonio Pass with gusts up to 103 miles an hour. We're not talking about a hurricane. That's just a sea breeze, and I'll talk more about how that can happen in just a second. When we do have high winds that uproots things like trees, this photograph from a windstorm happened in 2009, which did over $3,000 on my roof at my home in Palm Springs. And where I live, we don't usually get any wind, but there was a real blockbuster wind on April 11th. I have a tile roof, and it actually lifted the tiles, nailed down into the roof, lifted the tiles off, and blew them around like paper plates. It was quite amazing. So wind is a factor. Got another picture here, truck blown over, June 1975. And then another photograph showing wind that blows across the road on Indian Avenue. Just last week, they had to close Indian Avenue to traffic because of high winds. Those are some of the bad things that happen. Here's one of the good things, though. In all of the world, the Coachella Valley has the best ventifax of any location on planet Earth. These are located on Garnet Hill, like this huge boulder you see here, and their surfaces have been polished and eroded and cut by wind-carrying blow sand that has done this to the boulders. And you can go over to Garnet Hill. It's right off Indian Avenue, just a little bit south of Interstate 10. It's the only hill around there. And because the movements along the San Andreas Fault have raised up that hill over the last 500,000 years, it has also lifted up all the different rock types that it had. And on that hill, you'll find quartz rocks and granite rocks and some limestone rocks and even some marble rocks, because that hill, when it was flat and at ground level, was receiving all these rock types washed down from floods coming out of the surrounding mountains for many millions of years. Then the hill was raised up, and it exposed all these rocks, and each different kind of rock will be carved in a different way by the wind. We call them ventifacts, and when I say the best in the world, these are the best ventifacts in the world that you can pick up with your hands, or you can transport with a truck. And we've actually had some people go out there and pick up some of these boulders, some of which are almost the size of a VW, to take them back to their yards to have as interesting landmarks on their own property. It's not posted, and it's not illegal to do that. And the good news is that every time one ventifact is removed, another one will be exposed, and wind will start carving it there. This is another area where we have these polished granite rocks, and this one is just off Date Palm Road, again, just south of Interstate 10, another place that any of you can visit at any time. And because of these prevailing winds and how powerful they are, we have the best small ventifacts any place on the planet. If we go back in time and look at the center of the Coachella Valley, in this photograph taken in 1926, the entire valley floor was covered with sand dunes and sand hummocks, like you see here. Today, there's only about 5% of those dunes left. But this is 1926, before the widespread development of our area. Now, here's why it's so windy. And I'm going to use the pointer here. Oh, there it is. Got it upside down, I see. Okay, here's the San Gorgonio Pass. This is Palm Springs. Rancho Mirage is right about here. It's because of the San Gorgonio Pass that winds are so pervasive and so powerful, depending on the time of year that we're looking at. See if I'm going the right way. There we are. What happens is that because it's relatively hot on the land and relatively cool over the ocean, the hot air rises in the Coachella Valley, particularly during late spring and early summer, and that hot air rising creates a thermal low pressure system which sucks in relatively cool air from the coast. And so we have sea breezes that then go into the San Gorgonio Pass. And so that 10, 15 mile per hour sea breeze, as a result of what we call the Venturi effect, accelerates the wind up to 4 times. So if it's a 15 mile an hour wind coming through the pass, by the time it gets through the pass, it's now 60 miles an hour. And as I said, once in 1979, wind speeds reached 103 miles an hour because wind gusts at that time on the ocean side of the mountains were 25, 30 miles an hour, very breezy, and then accelerated 4 times coming through the pass. That's a catastrophe if you're driving your car in that area. The other part of the good news, though, is that's why we have one of the best wind resources by acre, if you will, or by size of any place in the United States because of the San Gorgonio Pass, and that's why all the wind generators are there. People always say, how much electricity is produced by one of those wind generators? It used to be about enough electricity to power 40 homes, and because of the increased efficiency of each wind generator, it's now one of those produces enough power for about 400 homes over the course of a year. In other words, they generate enough electricity to power 400 homes for a solid year. And if you're a fringe-toed lizard, you love the San Gorgonio Pass and all the wind and the sand that is picked up by the wind. And that's why we have some endemic species here in the isolated dunes of the Coachella Valley, species not found anywhere else on planet Earth, and they love that wind-blown sand. So when you say, oh, we have to stop the wind-blown sand, you're not talking to the lizard because it likes it. And we have a plant, the Coachella Valley milkvetch that you see here, is also an endangered species, only found in areas where there's lots of loose wind-blown sand. Now, what's the frequency of moderately damaging winds? Well, we'll have moderately damaging winds. That means there'll be property damage. Usually we're looking at something under $50,000. We can expect that every year based on the number of cars that are damaged, their paint or windshields by wind-carried sand. Frequency of severe windstorms causing widespread damage, that's about once each decade. And that happened in 2009 when we had well over $3 million worth of damage in the Coachella Valley because of those April winds. And usually winds aren't as strong in April as they would be in June. So about once a decade, you really need to worry about it, and about once a year, you need to worry about it in the sense of be careful where you drive. Tornadoes. There's one record of a tornado in the Coachella Valley. We're not really set up for tornadoes because we don't have cold air fronts coming down and meeting north, or cold air fronts coming from the north and moist air coming from the south like you would see in the Great Plains. So tornadoes are not something we need to worry about here. That one tornado occurred up Highway 74 near the town of Pinion, and that occurred about 25 years ago. It did destroy one house and damage 2 others, but very, very rare. How about hurricanes? Don't need to worry about hurricanes here. The ocean water temperature off the coast of California is too cold for hurricanes almost all the time. And here in the Coachella Valley, we're too far from the ocean to have to worry about hurricanes, so we can cross that off the list. Not something we need to worry about. Wildfire. Okay. When I first arrived in the Coachella Valley in 1972, wildfires on the valley floor were not something we ever needed to worry about. There wasn't enough fuel on the floor of the valley to carry a wildfire that might start in the forested mountains and then move down into the valley and across the desert. That never happened, never. That's changing now. In addition to that, we now we're in a situation where because of recurrent drought, we're now in the 4th year of a very severe drought, and I'll talk about that later. But the drought creates very dry conditions, and so when you have dry conditions and a little bit warmer temperatures, you're going to get more wildfires. So Joshua Tree National Park, where this photograph was taken, suffers at least a half a dozen wildfires every single year now, whereas back in the 1970s, wildfires happened about every other year in the park. So that's almost a 10-fold increase in wildfires because of drought and the drying out of vegetation. Chino Canyon, and this fire in 2005, was the beginning of a new era in wildfires in the Coachella Valley region because that particular fire was able to move down the mountain slopes and then start feeding on a lot of dry plant material. And in places, that wildfire and a couple of others after that actually went down on the valley floor and almost reached Desert Hot Springs. We're 1 mile from Desert Hot Springs as they moved across the desert. The last big fire we had was the Mountain Fire, July of 2013, photograph taken from my house. We had to leave town because it was so smoky. So wildfires are getting more frequent and tend to be more severe than they used to be. Here's a photograph of another wildfire. This is the Willis Palms wildfire in 1983. This one was started by vandals. Most of our wildfires are started by lightning today. Vandals account for, at least in wildfires that I'm aware of, account for less than 10% at the present time. This is Willis Palms. It completely survived this fire. Palm oases, by the way, they really don't have an issue with fire. In fact, in our studies on palm oasis ecology, we found that most desert palm oases thrive in a fire regime. So in other words, the more frequently they burn, the better the palms do. The palms themselves are resistant to fire because the heat of the fire is not able to penetrate deep enough into the trunk to damage the core tissue of the tree. And so within 4 months after a fire, they put out a whole new crown. They survive fires very well. This is the second most frequent cause of fires in our desert region, and that would be fires started accidentally by humans. And I'm not usually talking about, somebody throwing out a lit cigarette out of their window or something. This Indian Canyon fire of September 2011 was a small fire, but it was started by a welder who was working on a water pipeline in that area, and some sparks went into the dry brush. And there's a lot more dry brush than there used to be, and this is the culprit. Back in the 70s, when I first arrived here, Sahara mustard, an introduced plant from North Africa and the Mideast, was almost non-existent in our area. And today, it is the most common and widespread plant we have on the floor of the Coachella Valley. Unfortunately, it crowds out most of our native wildfires, or wildflowers, and so it really has taken over. In fact, I have a picture of a field of desert dandelion, but there actually are more Sahara mustard plants growing up and around the desert dandelions. The problem with Sahara mustard is that after it dies at the end of spring, it has this persistent dry skeleton that continues to remain upright for 3 or even 4 years in some cases. And because of its density, sometimes all the plants are touching each other for mile after mile after mile. When the fire comes down from the mountains and hits the desert floor, there's not just a few scattered creosote bushes anymore. There are the dried skeletons of Sahara mustard, skeletons left over for many years before that fire. And that is what enabled fire in 2005 to move down from the mountains onto the valley floor, because the valley floor was covered with the dried skeletons of Sahara mustard. So this is a problem plant, not just because it crowds out wildflowers, but because it enables wildfires to move out onto the floor of the valley and more likely to come in contact with homes and businesses. Fires, if it's windy, these fires are hard to control. If it's not particularly windy, these fires are fairly easy to control because they don't have near as much fuel as, say, a mountain forest. The good news, though, is that there's a lot of animals that love to eat the new vegetation that comes up after fire. Some of you have heard me say before that in the natural world, if it can burn, it will burn, and it needs to burn in order for a plant community to have a tremendous vitality. And that vitality is the growth of new plants coming up from seeds, which are juicier and have a much higher protein content than the old plants that preceded them. And so bighorn sheep, mule deer, they love post-burn areas, assuming that we get adequate winter rainfall. So what is the frequency of destructive wildfires in our area? And this would include the mountains that face into the Coachella Valley. Frequency of destructive wildfires are about twice each year. That means there'll be some property damage. And then, of course, it costs sometimes millions of dollars to fight fires. So about twice each year, expect that number to go up to 3 or 4 or maybe up to 6 times in the decades ahead, if the continued drought we've been experiencing now for 4 years continues. If that continues, expect wildfires to increase in frequency up to 6 times more than they are today. So that 2, maybe we should change to 6. All right, floods. We have 2 kinds of floods. The good floods are the winter storm floods, because these, in the wintertime, our rain events are very slow. We just get maybe 1/10 of an inch of rainfall an hour, and if it continues to rain through the whole day, we don't even get an inch. But it comes down slowly. Most of that water sinks into the soil. There's relatively small amounts of evaporation because temperatures are colder in the wintertime. So it takes a lot of consecutive winter storms to fill up the whitewater channel that you see there. It can be impressive, but something like that is a result of not just one storm, but many, many winter storms. But again, the rain coming down very slowly. It can be impressive, though. That water was extended to almost 80 yards across the whitewater channel during this particular series of winter storms a few years ago. A lot of the washes fill up with water during that time. Here's a roadway. This is the Snow Creek Road, a little bit to the west of Palm Springs, flooded out. I used to live in Snow Creek Village. How many of you know where Snow Creek Village is? Raise your hand if you know where Snow Creek Village is. Okay, it's to the north and west of Palm Springs, around the corner as you get on Highway 111 and drive in towards Los Angeles. You go right by Snow Creek Village. And I used to love it because about 4 or 5 times a year in a normal year, I got to call in work and saying, I can't come in because I can't get across the road. It's flooded again. Got out of work a few days. And these scenes are fairly typical when we have successive winter storms. The good news from winter storms is that we get a lot of wildflowers. And these are desert dandelions, a photograph taken in Desert Hot Springs in 1994, as I recall. So wildflowers thrive when we have above average amounts of winter rain. Summer storms are entirely different. Summer storms, we experience water coming down very hard, in a very short amount of time. We actually have records in the Coachella Valley of over 4 inches of rainfall falling in 1 hour in certain places in the Coachella Valley as a result of summer storms. Now, they're rare in comparison with, say, Tucson, Arizona, where they happen several times a week, but they can be very destructive. They're usually accompanied with lightning, unlike typical winter storms. Washes fill up very, very quickly. You can wash things away like me. If you look carefully in that picture, you can see me right in the center there. Washed away by a flood. I survived that one. This is a photograph taken out the slider in my backyard of a normally dry waterfall pummeling down in a massive waterfall that we normally don't ever see, about once every 3 years. Streets of Palm Springs when we've had severe cloudbursts in the summertime. So summer storms, because the air is warmer, and warm air holds more air than cold air, so winter versus summer, in other words. Summertime, the air holds more water. Usually these storms come into us from the Gulf of California. They're coming northward, sucked into the very hot conditions of the Coachella Valley because of that thermal low that I talked about earlier, where heat's rising off the desert floor, creating a low pressure system, which can suck these storms in off the Gulf of California. And it's warm air, carries a ton of water, and as it rises over the peninsular ranges and some of the other mountain ranges in Southern California, that air cools and then drops its load of water in huge cloudbursts. Good news is that some plants, like the smoke tree you see in that picture, thrive under situations where they get a lot of water running down a wash course. We've done some studies on smoke tree seeds, and the seeds of the smoke trees only germinate typically after they've been abrased and churned about in sand and gravel-carried water in a flash flood, particularly in summertime. We get more germination of smoke tree seeds after a summer downpour than we do a winter downpour. And they're called smoke tree, by the way, because from a distance they look like a puff of smoke. I don't know if I actually believe that, but that's what it said. In any event, if you see a smoke tree growing next to your house, then you know you're in a floodplain. Yeah, a bit of a problem there. Now, if you plant it, of course, it's fine. But I was doing some work on burrowing owls up near Desert Hot Springs about 3 months ago. And we were looking for burrowing owl burrows, but we found all these baby smoke trees growing in a new wash that was created by residential development. And I said, you know, you've got flash flood risks here. We can tell because all the smoke trees that germinated because of some runoff during the summertime. And so these are plants that are only found in areas subject to sheet flooding, or in some cases, very concentrated flooding events in the Coachella Valley. So if you're buying a house and you see a smoke tree in the lot next door, maybe look someplace else, unless somebody planted it there. This is a photograph. I think I have the date on this one. Yeah, this is the flood of August 2011. This is when 4 inches of rain fell near the town of Mecca in the southeastern part of the Coachella Valley, down near the town of Coachella. And it completely obliterated vast areas of even creosote bushes. But if you go back there today and take a picture, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of smoke trees have sprouted up in these runoff areas near Mecca. But these are the most serious, potentially most deadly storms. And here's Palm Canyon Wash with lots of smoke trees growing in it. These came up en masse after a flood that occurred in 2002 in the Palm Springs area. So that's good. If you like smoke trees, and a lot of birds do, then flash floods are great. Blizzards. This is some interesting stuff. You say, oh, what is this? The Coachella Valley. We don't have blizzards here. That's not true. I think there's a picture. This is 1979, photograph taken right in the middle of Palm Springs. And this, about 5 inches of snow fell on that January day. And I was amazed at the time, and just recently I went back because I was curious. I couldn't remember that it had snowed since 1979 anywhere in the Coachella Valley. So I went back in the historical records back to 1895, and I went through all the records, and I found that it snowed in the Coachella Valley from 1895 until 1979 on average about once every 10 years. Okay? So you go through the records, and about every 10 years you'd see, oh, Palm Springs got snowfall. 10 years go by, oh, Palm Springs got snowfall. Actually, it snowed in both 1973 and 1979, kind of twice in one decade, if you will, very unusual. But we haven't had snow in Palm Springs on the valley floor, anywhere in the valley floor, since 1979. So we're way past average now. It's been, that's over 30 years and we haven't had any snowfall. And I will make a prediction right now, even if you live to be 150 years old, you will never again see it snow on the valley floor in the Coachella Valley. And the reason is that we don't have cold enough winter temperatures that allow this to happen. We get rain instead, not snow. And it's just too warm, and this is a very good day to say that. I mean, it's February, early February, and what is it? They said it's going to be 88 degrees today or something. We haven't had snowfall since 1979 because it's too warm. Back then, when I first came to the valley, we'd get temperatures close to freezing in Palm Springs and definitely elsewhere in the Coachella Valley. But we don't see such cold temperatures anymore. Not in Palm Springs. Occasionally you see it below freezing down in the Mecca area, but not in the upper Coachella Valley, never in Rancho Mirage, for example. Not anymore. So in a way that's good, but it also tells us something about our environment and what's happening in more recent times. So you don't need to worry about blizzards anymore. Not something that's going to happen. Tsunamis, what I used to call tidal waves, which isn't a very good word. The tsunami's better. We're too far from the ocean. The tallest tidal wave that is thought to have occurred on planet Earth that's been measured by geologists is about 500 feet. So I live in Palm Springs at an elevation of 705 feet. So even if a tidal wave came up the Gulf of California and enveloped the Imperial and Coachella Valleys, I would be safe. Now in Rancho Mirage, you might not be safe. I don't know. The good news, though, is that tidal waves would never come up the Gulf of California. The directions are wrong. They wouldn't get enough speed going to ever even come close to reaching us. And we have the San Jacinto Mountains and the San Bernardino Mountains to the west that protect us from tidal waves. So we don't ever need to worry about those, and we can cross those off the list, too. Volcanic eruption. Okay. What's he talking about? Volcanic eruption? I want to tell you right now that geologists are predicting the most likely spot for the next volcanic eruption in the greater Coachella Valley region is at the southeastern shore of the Salton Sea. Okay? Probably, if it happens, probably near Obsidian Butte, which some of you might have visited. A lot of bird watchers go there to look at birds because it's a small volcanic dome that you can walk up and then overlook the entire Salton Sea from that area and see a lot of birds from Obsidian Butte. And that is most likely where probably not something like this. Something on a much smaller scale. This is a photograph of a cinder cone taken near Amboy. It's now extinct, but it erupted just a couple thousand years ago that, to a geologist, that's a drop in the bucket. Not very long at all. I took this photograph with the sun setting in the caldera of the cinder cone volcano to make it look like it was erupting, but it really wasn't. In any event, this is something that has happened in the California desert regions in the past. If you take a plane and fly over the Mojave National Preserve, for example, you'll just see one volcano after another. These are small volcanoes. We call them cinder volcanoes, or cinder cones is the appropriate term. And all of these are less than 50,000 years old. So these are very recent volcanic events. And these are in the Mojave Desert, not even 100 miles from where we are right here. So we have had recent volcanic activity, and the reason for that is that we, right here in the library, we are on the Pacific Plate. And on the other side of the valley, on the other side of Interstate 10, those people are on the North American Plate. And this is two floating crusts of the Earth's mantle that are moving and jostling about. Right now, the Pacific Plate is kind of sliding past the North American Plate. The seam between those two plates is called the San Andreas Fault, which is right smack in the center of the Coachella Valley. Ours are sliding past each other, but at times, some of one plate will actually move under the other, and then it's melted as it approaches the Earth's core, and that's why we have all those cinder cones in the Mojave Desert in the photograph I just showed you, is because the one plate is melting, and as it does so, it expands, and if there are fissures, it can send volcanic material up to the surface, creating a cinder cone, a small volcano, or in some cases, a big volcano. That's the process. So here we are in the Coachella Valley, and that's where it is predicted that if we have a volcanic eruption in California, the next one will probably occur right there at the southeastern shore of the Coachella Valley. There's frequent earthquakes there. Most of them we can't feel, but there's a lot of earth activity down there. It is molten. It has spewed up lava. Obsidian Butte is actually basalt that was exuded up near the surface probably less than 15,000 years ago. So there has been volcanic activity in that area in the past. And because of the amount of activity there now, geologists are making that prediction. So imagine, and the nice thing about it is that location is downwind from the Coachella Valley. So if there's a volcanic eruption there, all that smoke and ash will be blown into Arizona. So we don't need to worry about it. So you can actually go there and watch the volcanic eruption and know that all the stuff will be blown into Arizona. Well, because the prevailing winds are coming from west to east here in the Coachella Valley region. That's important because I'm going to talk about something else in just a second. In any case, so go there and maybe you'll see a volcanic eruption. When? Not tomorrow, probably not in the next 10 years, but all bets are off after that. So we just don't know. It's a result of the fact that the molten material is closer to the surface there than any place else in the state of California, with the possible exception of Mammoth Lakes. And in addition to that, it's right along the San Andreas Fault, which can facilitate, because there's a lot of cracks in the earth associated with the fault, it can provide a conduit for molten material to come up to the surface. And there's a lot of earth movement activity down in that area. It's one of the most seismically active areas, not just in California, but anywhere in North America. So those are all signs of a potential volcanic eruption and make it most likely to occur there than any place else. Now, I've talked about all this mayhem. We have to have a respite, so I show you a nice, cute little puppy to kind of give your sense, chance, calm down. God, he's told us about floods and volcanoes and horrible windstorms. Now, earthquakes. Okay. You can't live in the Coachella Valley very long without experiencing an earthquake. We live right near the San Andreas Fault. Goes right through the center of the Coachella Valley. We have many, many splinter faults. Palm Canyon, the most spectacular palm oasis in the world south of Palm Springs, is a result of a fault in the earth called the Palm Canyon Fault, which eventually does dovetail into the San Andreas Fault in the middle of the valley. If you go to the lower portion of the Indio Hills near Dillon Road, you can see these sedimentary deposits that have been twisted and contorted. These are deposits that should be horizontal with the surface of the earth. They were laid down that way, but now, because of movements along the San Andreas Fault, they've been actually turned vertical. That's just to give you a visual idea of just how active the San Andreas Fault is, particularly in the lower Coachella Valley. You can walk over there at any time. It's very easy to see this just where Dillon Road crosses the All-American Canal. There's some pretty good dirt roads there. You can take a street vehicle about a mile to the west and then just start walking amongst the Indio Hills, and you can see scenes like this. Most of you, though, have probably seen movements along the San Andreas Fault in Painted Canyon. Painted Canyon has a nice road that you can drive into. It's called Painted Canyon because it has all these different colored rock surfaces exposed. It's one of the most popular hiking places in the valley. Again, these sedimentary materials should have been horizontal with the ground, but along the San Andreas Fault, when we have earthquakes, over a period of millions of years, it's tilted them on edge, so now they point straight up. Again, another example of very dramatic earth movements in the area. California has a long history of earthquakes. This is the first one that I experienced, the Sylmar quake in 1971. I was living in Los Angeles. I was going to UCLA at the time, and I lived in the upper story of an apartment building. There was a two-story apartment building. I lived in the upper story, and in 1971, on February 9th, that earthquake hit, and I'm a naturalist, so I often have strange critters in my life. And I had a big aquarium with a turtle, 50-gallon aquarium, and it was on the upper level of that apartment building. And there was so much rocking of the water, 25 gallons sloshed out of the tank onto the rug. Big earthquake, and I wasn't even close to the epicenter. I was in southeastern Los Angeles, not northwestern Los Angeles area. So earthquakes, we have a rich history in California in general. This photograph taken of an earthquake in Desert Hot Springs, as I recall, in 1976, if I'm not mistaken, a mobile home collapsed, not too much, not serious damage. A bridge near Whitewater was uplifted on one side. Now it has a little 6-inch ledge. This is an abandoned roadway, so it didn't cause problems for motorists. Yucca Valley quake of 1979. Crack on this dirt road, which you can see here. The Landers earthquake is the largest quake we've had in the area. June 28th, 1992, 7.3. Had an earthquake like that hit downtown Los Angeles, there would have been probably well over 1,000 deaths. Because it was in Landers in a very remote area where very few people lived, we just saw some displacement of the earth. But it's significant. It's a 3-foot uplift on the right as opposed to the portion on the left there. This is a home in Landers that was made unsafe by the earthquake. And this image reminds me of something I need to tell you, that during an earthquake, the best place to be is in a wood frame stucco house, 1-story. There is not a single record in the state, in the whole history of California, of anyone ever dying if they were in a 1-story wood frame stucco home, because the home won't collapse. And that's even under some pretty severe earthquakes. This home experienced 7.3. Nobody was injured inside, even though they were inside when the earthquake struck. And so that's the best place to be. The worst place to be is where there are a lot of tall buildings. Earthquakes are dangerous primarily because the structures we're living in are not stable. And if we live where there are a lot of tall structures, then there's a lot greater risk because those buildings are not going to be nearly as stable and cannot withstand anywhere near the shaking of a 1-story wood frame stucco house. Now, the safest place to be in an earthquake would be in a tent in the center of the Coachella Valley. Then I can guarantee you, no matter how powerful the earthquake, you'll be safe. But in a 1-story structure, again, no recorded deaths of one of those structures collapsing and killing people inside. Now, the one exception that I know of is on this earthquake, there was a guy who had a big tube television set on a shelf above his pillow and his head where he was sleeping at the time. The television fell off the shelf and killed him, but I don't know that I'm going to blame the earthquake on that. So as long as you don't do anything stupid. My wife, now I live in a 2-story structure in Palm Springs. It's a condominium and it's 2 stories. And so my wife and I have an evacuation plan in our house. And what we're going to do, if we feel an earthquake, no matter what time of day or night, we run out into the street and get out of the structure, because there have been some 2-story wood frame stucco homes that have collapsed. And there have been a few, not many, but a few deaths as a result of those collapses. Normally, 2-story structures handle earthquakes quite well, but a little bit more risk. So regardless of the time, night or day, we run out into the front yard where there's no falling objects that will injure us. Now, the problem is that if it happens at night, most people aren't dressed properly to go out in the front yard. God forbid, maybe they aren't dressed at all. So what they're going to do is they're going to stop and put on something presentable before they go out in the front yard. So the best advice I can give any of you is live in a 1-story stucco home, wood frame, and wear something appropriate at night so that you can go out in the front yard and you're not embarrassed if your neighbors see you. That's the best advice I can give you. Because if you take 10 seconds to put something on, it's too late. Too late. So you have to have appropriate earthquake bedtime clothes. Very, very important for that. Some picture frames that damaged some art in a minor earthquake in the Palm Springs area. This is a overpass where you can see the displacement of the overpass broke that pipe that's on top of it, 1992. And then this photograph reminds me of something I need to tell you, and this is serious now. The biggest problem of a major earthquake striking the Coachella Valley is that the water lines will break, and you will not have water to come to your home. I'm talking about an earthquake with a magnitude now of 7.5 or greater. Water lines are likely to break, and you're not going to have water in your home, and this is a desert. It's going to be, could be warm and dry if it's in the summer, and you need drinking water. So what you need to do is you need to stockpile drinking water someplace in your home. I recommend having at least 30 gallons or equivalent, which I have done. We take old pop bottles, and because they're very durable, and we fill them up, and we store some in the garage and some in our house, and we have about 30 gallons. Because you say, well, we'll get in the car and we'll drive down to the store and we'll buy some water there. But the problem is 7.5 earthquake, you won't be able to drive to the store. And in my case, the store is too far to walk and the store won't be open. So you need to have water. We can rely on fat deposits for a long, long time, some of us more than others, but we can rely on fat deposits for a long time. So you don't need to worry quite as much about food, but you need to worry about water. So make sure that all of you set aside at least 20 gallons of water someplace in your home, so that if you do have your water supply interrupted, you'll have access to drinking water for at least 3 days. That's the goal, even in the summertime. And that should work out quite well for you. And so that's, I'm being very serious there. Food you don't need to worry about. I know that may sound difficult, but water is what you must have. Now, you say, well, we've never had an earthquake 7.5 in this area. It just doesn't happen. Well, remember that 7.3 Landers earthquake. That 7.3 Landers earthquake, if its epicenter would have been in the Coachella Valley, could result in all the things that I've described: breaking of water mains, inability to drive to the store because of road closures, bridges collapsing, who knows what. And geologists are predicting a huge earthquake that will strike the Coachella Valley in the future. Say, well, what does he mean in the future? What is that? What's he saying? Okay. We have a history in the Coachella Valley of having a major earthquake, 7.5 magnitude or greater, on average, over the last 40,000 years, about once every 350 years. Okay? And that's almost like clockwork. It has been over 400 years now since we've had an earthquake of 7.5 magnitude or greater. So we're 10 months pregnant for an earthquake. So is it going to happen tomorrow? Almost assuredly not. Is it going to happen in the next month? Well, probably not. Is it going to happen in the next year? Maybe not. Is it going to happen in the next century? Most definitely. And you just want to be prepared if that happens. And preparation is getting the water into your home in the garage or someplace where you know you'll have access. Sometimes if it's the garage and you have an electric garage door opener and it won't open and the water's in there, you could be in trouble. But make sure you have adequate water and try to spend as much of your time in a single-story wood frame stucco home. That's the best place to be. So that's my advice with regard to earthquake. Minimally damaging earthquakes, that's where something might fall off the shelf or, you know, a broken window, something of that nature. About once every 20 years. Catastrophic earthquake, once every 350 years, and it's been over 400 years since we have had a catastrophic earthquake in the area. So it really is a good idea to take these precautions, particularly the water one in your home. If you have shelves and you have priceless objects on them, make sure you put that little buffer on the edge of a shelf so if it starts shaking, it might hit that little ridge before it topples off the shelf, stuff like that. And then move out of that two-story house. I'm looking for a home right now as I speak. Some catastrophes are not violent but evolve over years, decades, or even centuries. And this is the last one I want to talk about this afternoon. The Salton Sea. This is not a catastrophe, okay? And even if it was, it would play out over a long period of time. My views on the Salton Sea as a catastrophe are that it is not a catastrophe for people living in the Coachella Valley. And I do have some people that disagree with me on this particular point, including my editor at the Desert Sun and whatnot. But let me explain to you why. First of all, the Salton Sea is not a natural body of water. It was a dry lake bed in 1905 when it was artificially created because of an ill-conceived irrigation water that allowed Colorado River water to flow unchecked into the Imperial and Coachella Valleys for 2 years. Since that time, a lot of animals, particularly water birds, have been attracted to the sea, particularly as a result of the fact that in the 1950s, the California Department of Fish and Game captured fish that lived in the Gulf of California and brought them across the border and put them in the Salton Sea, where they did quite well for many, many decades. This is what the Salton Sea bed looked like in 1905, before the floodwaters. It was a dry lake bed with a lot of alkaline deposits on the surface that you see here. Can the wind pick up those alkali deposits and blow them around? Yes, most definitely. This happens on every dry lake bed, and there are over 100 of them in California, including the Owens Lake, for example, and throughout the Southwest, in fact, in deserts around the world. Dry lake beds are typical. They're usually covered with alkaline deposits. The wind comes up, picks those up, and deposits them somewhere. Here's a satellite photograph of the Coachella Valley, and I'll point out a few things. Here's the Salton Sea. Here is where all of us live, I hope. Here's where the Imperial Valley on the south end of the Salton Sea. Here's the Gulf of California, Pacific Ocean over here, just to give you a little bit of geography as we're looking at this. Okay. If you believe that we need to do something about the Salton Sea, that we need to keep the water level up so it doesn't become a dry lake bed and we don't have alkaline deposits blown off the lake bed into places where people live, then my recommendation is to try to figure out if we can get along with our neighbors in Mexico and say, hey, you guys, we want to build a canal from the Gulf of California to the Salton Sea. And we will allow seawater to move into the Salton Sea to replenish all the fresh water that is no longer going to come into the sea when the new water use agreements take effect in a few years. And that salt water will keep the Salton Sea at a nice, visually pleasing level. The good news is that it's a downhill run. You don't need to use 1 gallon of fossil fuel to move that water from the Sea of Cortez to the Salton Sea, or what we call the Salton Trough. Low, below sea level area of land, in fact, the largest area below sea level land anywhere in North America. And that water can flow downhill and fill up the sea. And then when you don't want any more water, you close the gate. When you want more, you lift it up. You can hire somebody to do that, I guess. It's, in the long run, it would be by far the cheapest solution. Now, you might say, well, gee, that salt water's coming in, and then the fresh water evaporates away. Isn't it going to get saltier and saltier and saltier? Yes. It's not a perfect world. It will get saltier and saltier, but you can do what Jordan and Israel have done, and that is they have used ocean water to return the Dead Sea, or they're beginning to do this, to return the Dead Sea to its former historical level. And both Israel and Jordan, we're talking about a Muslim nation and a Jewish nation, have got together, made agreements so that ocean water can flow into the Dead Sea, bring it back up to its normal, pleasingly aesthetic level. And that both of them have already built all these health resorts along the western and eastern shores of the Dead Sea. Those are already built. And then people go there and they go into the therapeutic waters of the Dead Sea that have a very high salinity, and they bob around in the water. I've done that. Bobbing in the Dead Sea is a lot of fun because it's so saline that your buoyancy is remarkable. It's almost impossible to dive down in the water, which you wouldn't want to do. And it is therapeutic because the alkaline concentration is so high in the water, it kills any bacteria that might be on your skin. So if you have an open wound that's infected or something, that salt water, an hour in the salt water, will kill most of the bacteria and probably result in infection going away much more rapidly. That's what we should do with the Salton Sea. Let it get saltier and saltier. Yes, the fish will die. The odor will go away because there'll be no more organic matter to die because the saline level's too high in the sea. The odor will go away and never to return. And then we build resorts along there and people can go bob in the salty water. You don't want to put your head under real water that will be as salty as in the Dead Sea or what might happen in the Salton Sea because it stings your eyes horribly. But you can bob in it, so that's kind of fun. That's my solution. No energy loss because you're going downhill for the water. You're making it scenically visible, and you completely eliminate any threat of any toxic dust blowing off the surface of a dry lake bed. It's the cheapest way to do it. You do not want, though, to have seawater circulating in the Salton Sea. You don't want to have to build a second canal that pumps Salton seawater back into the Gulf of California because that costs money, a lot more money, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. And when you're looking for a solution to any problem, you always want to choose the simplest and cheapest solution first, not the most complex one, not the one that costs a lot of money, because when economic times get bad, you bail out on those expensive propositions. So a single canal, go into the Salton Sea, let it get scenically nice, and then build your resorts along the shores. It'll get saltier every year, become more and more appealing. Now, I want to talk about one last thing that's related to this, and that is, it is often said, and you read this all the time, that, oh, well, here's what will happen. Once the fresh water is cut out from going to the Salton Sea, then it will dry up, and you'll have these toxic winds blowing all this alkaline stuff into the Coachella Valley. That is patently false. None of any pollutants that might come off that dry lake bed, none of them are going to come into the Coachella Valley. And you know why now? Because the wind comes from west to east. That's the prevailing wind. Here's what we call a windrose. And these are really neat devices. And what this clearly shows is that, and these are winds from 1973 to 2013. The wind direction comes from the northwest almost all the time. And not only is the prevailing winds coming from the northwest and almost nothing from the southeast, where Salton Sea would be here, down here, nothing comes from there. They come and move all that material away from the Coachella Valley. Well, you might say, well, where does it go? It goes into a small portion of the Imperial Valley. By the time it gets to Yuma, Arizona, it will be so dispersed it won't be a health hazard anymore because that's over 60 miles away. And consequently, It's a great fabrication to say that there's a problem of wind blowing the materials off the Salton Sea into the Coachella Valley. That's not going to happen. When it is windy, the winds are not powerful enough to pick up material from the lake bed, the dry lake bed, if we don't put fresh water into it anymore. It's too not strong enough to blow materials into the valley. These are very weak, very, very weak winds. So that's the reality that you see right there. And that's why I argue that it's not something we need to worry about here in the Coachella Valley. Now, if I was in the Imperial Valley, I'd probably look at it somewhat differently because of the potential for some of that material to move into very rurally occupied areas. But again, most of the pollutants that Imperial Valley deals with come off of agricultural fields. Pesticides, herbicides that blow off the fields, and that's one of the reasons that that's the primary reason why respiration problems are so serious there, and that's not going to change regardless of what happens with the Salton Sea. Recurring drought, I did want to mention this. This is it's something that's happening right now. Because we're in the 4th year of a drought, in nature, it's becoming catastrophic. It's a horrible problem. Beautiful beaver-tailed cactus now look like this. We're in the 4th year of a drought, and no signs of it changing. It's almost too late now for us to get enough winter rain to change that. So this is the one you'll be reading about in Ian Jane's articles in the Desert Sun from now on for quite a while, I suspect. Now, the chance that any one of the events that I talked about happening tomorrow is less than 1%. That's the good news. That is to say, it's extremely unlikely. The chance of any one of these events happening in the next 100 years is more than 95%, which, in other words, is extremely likely. So, thank you very much.